Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies to stream. And today we're talking about 20 excellent sci-fi movies currently on HBO Max. So if you're new to the channel, welcome, but I put out videos like this every single week. This is not my first time reviewing sci-fi movies on HBO Max. So sci-fi movies featured on recent HBO Max lists are absent from this one. Movies like Dune, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Blade Runner, those were in recent videos. I'll link to those in the description. But today we're talking about 20 more excellent sci-fi movies included with HBO Max. This list will feature movies you've heard of, maybe framed in a new light, as well as a handful of other movies you've likely never heard of. Today's video is sponsored by Raycon, but I'll be telling you more about them later in the video. But right now we're going to start with my number 20 pick, frequently asked questions about time travel. Released in 2009, this is a made-for-TV sci-fi comedy from the UK that actually stars Chris O'Dowd as he was on his way up, and it's got a sharp sense of humor in it. It's also really silly at times, and I will say, this is the lowest budget movie on this particular list, and it does show, but glossy special effects are not the reason you should be watching this movie. It is just a solid comedy that has a lot of fun with all the problems that time travel might present. Another underrated gem is Colossal, starring Anne Hathaway and Jason Sudeikis. They're both great in this movie, but they're both playing very against type, or at least they do the further this movie progresses. The interesting setup for Colossal, though, is there's a giant monster destroying Seoul, South Korea. Anne Hathaway's character eventually figures out that the monster is moving the same way that she moves, or at least when she's in a particular space. So it's clever, it's quirky, it's got kind of a weird element to it, but it ultimately ends up being about something. It's not just about this monster. There are some cool scenes of this giant monster destroying Seoul, but again, that's not really the reason to watch this movie. If I tell you where it goes, it's going to spoil it, but this one actually had a lot more meat on the bone than I was expecting when I originally watched it. Now, while my number 18 pick is definitely a sci-fi movie, it's actually a remake of a Stallone movie where he plays an arm wrestling champion over the top. Real Steel, however, stars Hugh Jackman and follows the same basic plot line of this estranged father going on a cross-country road trip with his son, and over the top, they're going to an arm wrestling competition, which is actually less silly than it sounds, and then here, they're going to a robot fighting championship, and that's where the sci-fi element kind of starts and ends. This really is kind of a father-son relationship story. The fight sequences with the robots are fun to watch, but this is a PG-13 movie kind of aimed at families. It's essentially Rock'em Sock'em Robots, the movie, with the plot of Over the Top, which does not sound very fun on paper, yet Hugh Jackman and the child actor here actually bring this thing to life a little more than you would expect. Now, I was a big fan of Pitch Black back when it was released. It's an insanely cool sci-fi flick, and it came out well before Vin Diesel was really a big star and household name. Then they went on to do The Chronicles of Riddick, which was this sort of neutered PG-13 epic that was really a dud, if I'm being polite. But Riddick lands somewhere in between. It does some of the world building that The Chronicles of Riddick tried to do, yet it is still a fairly small story that takes place on one planet. There's some mercenaries in the mix, and ultimately I think Riddick has a stronger story than Pitch Black has, but at the same time it's also kind of a shoot-'em-up sci-fi action movie. And there are really clever elements in this movie, particularly when it comes to the storytelling. So again, this movie is just very different than you would expect it to be, and much better than I think you would expect it to be. Now, my number 16 pick is technically not a movie. However, I recently rewatched the Animatrix, and it is so much better than I remember. In fact, I think I enjoy this a lot more than any of the sequels to The Matrix. So if you've never seen it, this was a collection of animated stories, all done by different legendary animators. It was released straight to DVD but each story kind of explores the concept of the Matrix in different ways, vastly different ways than they actually do in any of the movies, and that's what I found really refreshing about the Animatrix. Now, I remember enjoying it years back, however, the animation styles actually do hold up, and again, these stories that you're getting from this, essentially an anthology, and even if you've seen the Animatrix before, I recommend going back and revisiting it because there is a lot that could be done with the concept that they just for some reason decided not to do with the Matrix 4. Okay, my number 15 pick on this list is easily the weirdest one, so I don't recommend it for everybody, so listen closely, but this is from director Jonathan Glazer, who also did Under the Skin, starring Scarlett Johansson. So if you did not like Under the Skin, there's a slim chance you're going to enjoy Birth. This stars Nicole Kidman as a woman who tragically loses her husband. It's the first minute of the movie. And then years later, a young boy claims to be her reincarnated husband. That's the basic setup. But what is so different about Birth is it's done from this visionary director who doesn't do anything by the book, and it's a very strange movie as a result. It feels like a realistic situation. Like, Nicole Kidman does an amazing job on screen in this movie. She always does, but she makes this weird concept feel very raw and real. So it is an excellent performance piece, and I'll say the sci-fi elements are minute here. Really, the concept is science fiction or fantasy. It's listed in that category, but it's a really great movie for the art film crowd. If that's not you, I would steer away from Birth. You're going to find it boring. But if you found anything I've described here interesting, then Birth can be a really oddly intriguing movie. I personally do think Birth is the weirder movie just because it doesn't quite feel right. However, some of you might agree that my next pick is miles weirder, Beyond the Black Rainbow. Now, this is from director Panos Cosmatos, who's most famous for having directed Mandy with Nicolas Cage, a movie that I do think is superior to Beyond the Black Rainbow. However, I've heard him describe them as kind of the yin and yang, two separate things, kind of the inhale and exhale, and I do get that. There's this dark vibe to Beyond the Black Rainbow that is present in Mandy as well, yet this one feels a little bit more like an old Kubrick movie. Storytelling wise, it's pretty loose. In fact, it is more of a stylistic movie where the actual story isn't a bad one, but it's more of like a short form story. This easily could have been done as a short. However, you end up spending the bulk of the 90 minutes in this neon lit nightmare of a world, and it's really chilling. If you like synthwave or really strange out there stuff like Mandy and you've never seen Beyond the Black Rainbow, make this one of the first ones you watch off of this list. However, if you don't like really bizarre, twisted, psychedelic stuff that also happens to be exceptionally dark, do not watch Beyond the Black Rainbow, trust me. So Westworld is one of HBO's hit shows, not its biggest, but it's up there. And while that is an excellent show and it's got great sci-fi themes and it really fleshes them out, the original Westworld movie from 1973 is also an excellent choice. It is the exact same concept down to a T. At least the movie's very, very similar to the first season of Westworld. But for a sci-fi movie from 1973, Westworld is surprisingly nuanced. I think that's kind of why it works as a modern-day television show, but it's also kind of campy and fun. Michael Crichton, who's most famous for having written Jurassic Park and a handful of movies that were turned into books, wrote this and actually directed it. Yul Brynner does an amazing job as one of the mindless robots, but you've also got a young James Brolin in this movie. I absolutely love this movie. It really is one of my favorite sci-fi movies from this decade. Having been made in the early 70s, it really does kind of ooze that late 60s, early 70s vibe, which again, I think works really well for this particular story. If you were a fan of the show and you've never seen the movie, you owe it to yourself to watch the original. All right, I know some of you are going to giggle at my number 12 pick, but just hear me out. I happen to think Pacific Rim is an excellent sci-fi movie. Now, It's not deep, it's not particularly thought-provoking, yet when you line it up against other movies in its genre, say some of the more recent King Kong and Godzilla movies, while I did like those movies, I think Pacific Rim does everything those movies do much better. This is directed by Guillermo del Toro, and while it's not one of my favorite movies of his, he did make a killer non-stop action movie. I mean, when these giant robots start fighting these monsters, it is a kid's movie. I mean, having been one myself, this is what little boys do when they play. They get their toys and just smash stuff, and it's fun to watch, but with someone like Guillermo del Toro at the helm, again, an Academy Award-winning director, he does it right by never letting the action stop. In fact, some of the fight sequences in this movie, I know they're animated and they're basically like watching a cartoon, but they're so dazzling and they don't stop. They go on for an incredibly long amount of time because Del Toro knows that is why you put your butt in the seat in the movie theater. You didn't come to see all the little nuanced story of these monsters. I mean, that stuff's in there, but he glosses through it quickly and gets down to brass tacks and delivers a lot of fun action. Not necessarily the best way to handle a sci-fi movie, but really kind of one of the best ways to handle one of these types of movies. Now, if all this white hair in my beard doesn't age me enough, I'll go ahead and say I was a big fan of the X-Files when it was originally airing. And I happen to think that the original X-Files movie is a highly underrated sci-fi flick. This almost stands alone on its own. In fact, if you've never seen the X-Files, you don't know anything about it, you could definitely get into this movie. Now, there are plenty of elements here that carry over from the show that you'll either miss entirely or that won't quite make sense to you yet. The story in the movie does stand alone on its own. There's some fantastic sequences in this and some surprising ones. I love the way that this movie finishes, but I happen to love the beginning of this movie even more. This hole in the middle of the desert, and it all holds together well in this beautifully done movie that, again, just stands separate from the show. Be warned, though, there is a second X-Files movie they made. It's also included with HBO Max. Make sure you're watching X-Files Fight the Future from the 90s. So before moving on with my top 10 movies on this particular HBO Max list, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Raycon. So here are my everyday earbuds, and I absolutely love these things. And the everyday earbuds look, sound, and feel better than ever. And that's because Raycons come with these little silicone tips in different sizes that are interchangeable. That way you know you're gonna get a good fit when you tuck them into your ears, and they're not gonna fall out no matter what you do. I mean, jogging, jumping jacks, push-ups, whatever you're doing, they're not gonna come out. The earbuds themselves have an 8-hour battery life, and then with the backup battery in the carrying case, you get 32 hours on a single charge. And Raycon features 3 different sound modes: pure, balanced, and a bass boosted mode. You've also got features like noise isolation and an awareness mode, which means like if you're jogging out in the street, you can hear the things that are going on around you, which is much safer. Even with all that, the best thing about Raycon is you get the same quality audio you get from premium brands at half the price. So they're already an excellent deal, but my viewers are gonna save 15% off when they go to the link in the video description below, or you can just type in buyraycon.com/flickconnection, and again, you're gonna save 15%. I mean, I am kind of particular about music, and my Raycons really do sound great, which is probably why they have over 50,000 5-star reviews. So if you want yours, you want to save 15% on them, go to that link in the video description below, or just type in RAYCON.com/flickconnection, and you're going to automatically get that 15% discount. But speaking of awesome stuff, let's go ahead and talk about the top 10 movies on this list. Now, my number 10 pick on this list is actually the 3rd installment in a famous trilogy. However, it's the only sci-fi movie in said trilogy. I'm talking about The World's End. This is the final installment in Edgar Wright's unofficial trilogy. The other 2 movies would be Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. And I'll say, this is my least favorite of those 3 movies. However, it is in a close 3rd place. In this movie, a group of middle-aged men reunite to have one last epic pub crawl, ending at the World's End pub. On their way, they have encounters with some unhuman characters, and there's a ton of action action and wild sci-fi elements that unfold. On top of that, you get that excellent Edgar Wright English sense of humor and a real dazzling directing style. I mean, Edgar Wright has a lot of fun with the camera, things keep moving. His other films include Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Baby Driver. And again, this is one of my least favorite movies of his, yet it still ranks number 10 in a list of 20 bangers. Now, one of the great things about HBO Max for me is that they've got all these different hubs. They've got Cartoon Network, I've got stuff for the kids, they've got Turner Classic Movies, making HBO Max practically busting at the seams with classic movies, something that is not really on other streaming platforms. But they also include Studio Ghibli, which features some of the most amazing animated movies ever created, movies like Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle. And while some of those movies could have fit on this list, the one I picked is from 1984, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Now, the reason I picked this one is because it is lesser known than some of the other Ghibli movies. And myself being a child from the 80s, I absolutely love the look of this movie. This ultimately has a lot in common with Dune. I think if you were a big fan of Dune, whether it be the original or the newer one, you should definitely check this movie out. The style, the monsters, the costumes, everything that they created in this animated movie is absolutely fantastic, and it's unlike anything else. I mean, it does have that general Japanese aesthetic, but for the most part, the world that was created for this movie is unlike anything else, making this a really unique experience you can really only have on HBO Max right now. Okay, my next pick is technically a horror movie with strong sci-fi elements. It also comes from one of my favorite directors, Robert Rodriguez, yet I think a lot of people don't realize he actually directed The Faculty. Released in 1998, I consider The Faculty to be a quintessential 90s horror movie, if not one of the most underrated horror movies from the 90s. It's got a killer soundtrack, it's got a really glossy kind of 90s vibe, and then it just goes off the rails, turns into a wild romp of a movie with some pretty funny elements. I mean, you've got great actors in this too, including Jon Stewart, Josh Hartnett, Salma Hayek, Famke Janssen, Robert Patrick, Elijah Wood. I mean, a really fantastic cast for a high school horror movie, and this movie goes hard in the paint when it wants to. It's got a rough edge to it, but the violence and the gore is not really pervasive. It's not going to disgust you. It's just a wild ride of a horror flick from the late 90s that is still, to this day, highly underrated. Another movie that I think is kind of underappreciated, despite the fact that it was a hit when it came out, features some heavy hitter stars, and was turned into a series, I think maybe more than once. Even with all that, I think Limitless is underappreciated. Now, obviously, this movie has its fans, that's how they made spin-offs, but if it's been a while since you've seen it, I promise you forgot how solid and how tight Limitless actually is. Now, Bradley Cooper has turned into one of the greater actors in his generation, and it does show in this movie, but he wasn't really considered that when this movie came out. Robert De Niro has a cameo. It's far from one of his best performances, but the direction and the writing on this movie is solid, making it highly rewatchable. There's not a lot of fat on it where people are just talking and there's dribble. Each scene drives the movie forward, and just about every other scene is something interesting and different than you've likely seen in other movies. Especially for kind of a PG-13 crowd pleaser of a movie, I tend to find those rather dull and uninteresting because they're really trying to make them for a mass audience. Limitless falls into that category, yet it's sharp, smart, and incredibly clever. In fact, I ranked Limitless so high on this list, it's immediately below the 1990 Total Recall. Now, this movie, in terms of sci-fi, has so much going for it. It's based on a story by Philip K. Dick, who's one of the most famous science fiction writers of all time, and while the movie does deviate, it deviates in some really spectacular directions. Now, in no way am I suggesting this is a highbrow work of science fiction, but it's also not super lowbrow either. It has a lot of fun with the genre every chance it gets, yet the core story here does deal with some of the heavy themes in Philip K. Dick's work. But what I love about movies like this is that even if you're not wanting to think about it much, Total Recall is a visual feast. This movie has been remastered. It looks great on HBO Max, and it's another one where, even though I know it's a really popular movie, if it's been a long time since you've seen it, odds are you maybe not forgot how good it was or how much you enjoyed it, but you probably forgot how many fantastic scenes are packed into one movie here. My number 5 pick on this list is the least like a sci-fi movie. In fact, the mere suggestion that it is a sci-fi movie is a tiny little spoiler. However, if you haven't seen Vanilla Sky by now, you deserve the little sci-fi spoiler. This movie was a personal favorite of mine for quite a while. I enjoy a lot of elements here. 1, it's got a killer soundtrack. 2, it's got some amazing sequences that they shot for real, like Tom Cruise running through an empty Times Square. That's not done with CGI. They didn't erase people. They literally emptied Times Square to get that shot. But there's great supporting performances here, including a really killer one from Cameron Diaz, one that will surprise you. Penelope Cruz is always great, but you've also got Jason Lee playing a really great character. It's one of my favorite characters of his. And the movie itself is a mind-bender trip of a movie. It's ultimately a really wild concept that takes a while to get into, so expect a slow pace with this one. But if you've never seen it, Vanilla Sky is a really beautiful movie about something really tragic. My next pick on this list I consider to be one of the most clever sci-fi movies to have been released this century so far, Moon. Not only is this movie incredibly clever, but it also stars one of my absolute favorite actors, Sam Rockwell, and only Sam Rockwell, as he is the sole inhabitant of a base on the moon. So you get a little bit of a castaway element where he's having to act basically by himself. He does have a robot voiced by Kevin Spacey, but for the most part, you're stuck on a moon base with Sam Rockwell. And that makes for a pretty good movie. He's incredibly interesting to watch. However, something's not quite right. He starts to discover some things that are bone-chilling to say the least, and while Moon is far from a horror movie, it does deal with some terrifying concepts, and again, a really clever way that's just incredibly well produced. But above all the gloss and the glam and the great performance from Rockwell, Moon has one of the best, most interesting stories out of any movie I've talked about on this list so far. My number 3 pick is also one of the most clever sci-fi movies from this decade, definitely from the past 10 years, Ex Machina. Now, I have talked about this movie recently, but it did deserve to be on this list and does deserve the number 3 spot, possibly even higher. I may have made a mistake here. Again, great performances, glossy production, looks amazing, everything's convincing, blah, blah, blah. This was written by Alex Garland, who's one of my favorite science fiction writers of all time. Not only did he write and direct this gem, he also wrote and directed Annihilation with Natalie Portman, which was an even harder movie to wrap your head around, I think, than Ex Machina. But he also wrote 28 Days Later and Sunshine, 2 fantastic sci-fi flicks. If you're a fan of his work too, I also recommend checking out Devs. It's a series you can currently catch included with Hulu. It is just as clever as anything else he's created. However, I think Ex Machina might be his most successful attempt at storytelling. And then ultimately, this movie really does get its hooks in you. The movie itself kind of plays a trick on the audience that is not only a beautiful one the first time you watch it, but it warrants repeat viewings in order to catch all the brilliant little things Alex Garland hid along the way. Now, even with all of the epicness that's been on this list so far, my number 2 pick, I think, is the most epic movie on this particular list. At the very least, my top 2 picks are. My number 2 pick being Gravity. Now, this is a movie that I absolutely loved when I first saw it in the theater, and then I kind of didn't care to watch it again until recently, and my goodness, is this an incredible work of filmmaking. If you don't know, they had to invent new technologies in order to get a lot of the shots that you see here. And while I know it's all done on a soundstage with wires and everything, the shots that they created of these astronauts floating above the Earth's surface are absolutely breathtaking. And the way it was directed glues you to the action in a way nothing else on this list can do. It's basically a series of very long takes where the camera doesn't cut away, and that trick keeps you in the action. And I call it a trick because that's not an easy thing to do production-wise. It's much easier to shoot this shot here, that shot, edit them all, glue them together. But because Gravity features very, very few cuts, it feels like you are one of the astronauts along for this epic ride. Now, the only drawback to this movie for me is that it just keeps hammering. As soon as you feel like you can catch your breath, something else crazy happens. Then something else crazy happens, and it gets to be far-fetched and doesn't quite feel as real as it maybe could have, yet that's a small complaint to have for an action sci-fi movie, that there's too much action. But Gravity is a wild, beautiful ride. If you've never seen it, watch it on the biggest screen you can. Put headphones on if you have the option. It's the best way to check this movie out. Please don't watch it on your phone. And then my number one pick is one of my favorite movies of all time. Easily fits into my top 10 movies of all time, and especially in terms of action and sci-fi, it is one of the greatest, still holds up today. I'm talking about Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Now, I'm a fan of Terminator. I even happen to kind of like Terminator Salvation, which you can currently catch on HBO Max as well, but Terminator 2 is easily one of the greatest action movies ever made. In fact, this movie is so great that when they made Terminator 3, they essentially tried to do all the same stunt pieces that they did in the original, and all of them suck. None of them are even close to what James Cameron was able to do with Terminator 2. This is easily one of the greatest sequels ever created. The original Terminator is a fantastic movie. It's solid. It still holds up today. Yet Terminator 2 somehow topped it in literally every single aspect imaginable. The way this was shot looks amazing. It looks like it came out yesterday. I mean, this came out in 1991, 1 year after Total Recall. This movie, again, it looks like it came out yesterday. Total Recall looks great, but it looks like it came out in 1990. Terminator 2 is an amazing achievement. That's why James Cameron is one of the most successful directors in the business. Not only does he know how to do big, over-the-top action that is just incredibly fun to watch, he also glues all of that incredible action to a solid, compelling story, which is what you get with this movie. Honestly, I really do consider it to be one of the greatest movies ever made, especially for an action sci-fi flick. But that is the list. If you want additional recommendations, please go check out my website, DarrenVanDam.com. I'm not selling anything over there. I've just got a list of movies on the homepage and access to back catalog episodes of the show, episodes that I put out once or twice a week, so you will literally never run out of good movies to watch. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special sci-fi list, and you will see me on the next one.